Hey everyone, today we're going to continue on with the nervous system, and we're going to specifically look at how is our central nervous system protected. So far we've been learning about the central nervous system in terms of the brain. So how is the brain protected? But also we're going to tack on the spinal cord as well. So how is the spinal cord protected? Couple things that we've learned in previous chapters, including our integumentary and our skeletal system chapter, is our scalp and the skin. So our hair and our skin surrounding our vertebrae on our back and also our brain is protected by the skin of our head. This provides a sort of protection or cushion. We also in the skeletal system learned about the skull and the vertebral column. So our skull is going to protect our brain, while our vertebral column protects our spinal cord. There are three new forms of protection that we're going to be learning in this section, and that is our meninges, our cerebrospinal fluid, which is abbreviated CSF, and then our blood-brain barrier. So let's get started with our meninges first. What exactly are meninges? Well, these are connective tissue membranes that basically cover and protect our central nervous system. And it contains three major layers. The first one is your Dura Mater. The second one, which is about your middle one, that's your Arachnoid Mater. And your Pia Mater forms your third layer. Here's a picture that I'm going to bring up, and then we're going to talk about each of these layers. The first one, this is our most superficial part, and that's going to be the skin of your scalp. As you go deeper, the next layer is your periosteum. Then you have your bone of your skull. So this is going to be your cranial bone. From there, the first meninges that you hit is your Dura Mater. This is formed of two layers. You have your periosteal layer and your meningeal layer. Your periosteal layer, notice that that's the one closest to your bone. Your meningeal layer, this is going to be the one that's closest towards that middle layer, so it's going to be deeper down. Your next meninges is going to be your arachnoid mater, so this is going to be in the middle. This is actually described as very web-like, and if you look here, you can see the web-like part that we're going to talk about. The next one down is your Pia Mater, and this is going to be the one that's closest and going to be touching up next to your brain. Then once here, you have your brain in here. Hopefully you guys remember your brain. This is going to be your gray matter of your cortex, and this is actually your white matter. So we pointed those three layers out. Let's give a little bit more information in your notes. Your Dura Mater, which is the outermost part, this is a very leathery layer. It's actually double layered like I showed you on the last picture. You have your periosteal layer, which attaches to the inner surface of your skull. And then your meningeal layer, which is actually considered the outer covering of your brain. Basically, the Dura Mater also folds inwards in several areas, and one area that is of major concern is your falx cerebri and your tentorium cerebelli. These fold and actually help you separate your cerebellum, which we learned in the last section is for balance, and your cerebrum, which is the most superior part of your brain. So if I bring that picture back up, remember your periosteal and meningeal, this is your two layers. But I just want to bring up that falx cerebelli. This, again, is located here that helps separate your longitudinal fissure into halves. And then the other one here, I just want to kind of show you that you have your tentorium cerebelli, and this separates your cerebellum from your cerebrum. So I like to point that it separates those out. Your middle layer is your arachnoid layer. This is considered to be web-like extensions, and this spans your subarachnoid space, and it also attaches down into your Pia Mater. This space is full of cerebrospinal fluid, and there are little granulations that protrude that help absorb the cerebrospinal fluid that is in this area and bring it to the return of your blood. Your Pia Mater, this is your most internal layer, and this clings to the surface of your brain and your spinal cord. So here, when we look at this brain, I love it because it shows you what it looks like when it doesn't have those meninges on it and what it looks like when it does. So here we have our skull, our scalp is the outermost one, and then our Dura Mater, which is covering it. And then this is what it looks like if it doesn't have your Dura Mater. The next thing we're going to go on is your cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid has a composition similar to blood plasma. Now, you've never seen or talked about blood plasma, and just to go over it, blood plasma is mostly made up of water, but it does have proteins in there that help you clot. It has glucose in there, which is your form of sugar, and electrolytes. Now, electrolytes are things that have charge, like sodium ions, calcium ions, potassium ions, and things like that. And then carbon dioxide, which is going to be a respiratory gas, also including is O2. Cerebrospinal fluid has this stuff, but usually about less protein, some more vitamin C, and the ion composition, like sodium, potassium, calcium, are a little bit different. One thing to know about cerebrospinal fluid, and I'll ask it on your test, is it's actually formed in your choroid plexus. We talked about this. This is actually located in your epithalamus. Now, your cerebrospinal fluid, what's the function of it? It forms that cushion to protect your brain and spinal cord. In other words, it helps your brain float so it's not damaged by pressure of its own weight. Now, it's circulated through this arachnoid space, which is part of your meninges, through the ventricles of your brain, and even down to the central canal of your spinal cord. One thing to note is that CSF has to actually form and drain at a constant rate so that the pressure within your brain doesn't get too high. So your pressure and volume have to be maintained at a certain level. If the pressure gets too high or you have too much volume, it can actually be negative impact on your brain cells and actually put so much pressure on them, cells start to die. And this is when you see people go brain dead because of brain swelling. It's not good. If this happens, usually doctors try to drill a hole through your skull to help relieve some of that pressure. Now, this is not in your notes, and I'm not going to give you it on your test, but I just want to kind of show you cerebrospinal, how it circulates. One thing to note is that it's produced in your choroid plexus, and this is located in each ventricle. The CSF then flows through the ventricles into your subarachnoid space, and it does this through your median and lateral apertures, which are just pathways to get you into that space. Now, some of it is going to go down through your central canal to your spinal cord, but the rest of it is going to keep flowing through that subarachnoid space. And eventually, once it goes through all of your brain, it's going to be reabsorbed through something called your dural venous sinus. So here, this picture I've taken from your book, again, it's going to be created here in your epithalamus, and it's going to start flowing all throughout your brain. And some of it will go through this central canal down your spinal cord. The last thing we have to talk about in terms of how we protect ourselves is your blood-brain barrier. Now, this is a barrier that is between your brain and your blood, and this is actually this super doesn't want to let a lot of things through. It's not very permeable. In fact, it only allows certain things through, and others it doesn't. It will allow water through because water is an essential need, glucose in order to have energy, and then some amino acids in order to do some cellular processes. But it tries to keep out anything that can be potentially harmful, such as any waste that your body produces, urea, which is basically your urine, toxins, proteins can have a negative effect, and most drugs, they try to not have it affect your brain. Non-essential amino acids are also blocked out, and potassium ions as well. However, there are some things that they are useless against. Things can still pass through and affect our body, and this can actually have negative effects overall on us. Fats can still get through. Respiratory gases can get through, which is actually pretty good, because we need oxygen and carbon dioxide to breathe. But one thing that does get through that is negative is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide can actually prevent our brain from getting the oxygen that it needs, and it can die that way. Things that are a negative effect that we don't want in our brain is alcohol has an effect, and actually the part of our brain that it affects the most is our cerebellum, which is for balance. Nicotine can get through, anesthetics can get through. That's how you're able to be put to sleep. Now, we have all of these protections in place, but that doesn't mean our brain can't get injured. We have a lot of brain dysfunctions or things that can happen to our brain. In fact, something called TBIs or traumatic brain injuries are the leading cause of accidental deaths in the US. And these usually occur whenever we have some kind of blow to the head. So, whenever we fall or we hit our head, we can result in something called a concussion. And this is a slight brain injury. And often you don't see any nervous tissue being damaged, but there's still damage that you can't see. Most of the time, often our brain heals of this, and there's little permanent brain damage. A contusion, on the other hand, is where you've hit your head so hard or there is some kind of marked visible destruction to the nerve tissue. And when there is that much destruction, nerve tissue does not undergo mitosis that we learned about in the last test, so it doesn't regenerate. And sometimes a coma can happen. Now, if the blow is hard enough, death can occur, and usually they occur one of two ways. Usually there's too much intracranial hemorrhage, which just means bleeding of the brain. Or sometimes there's too much cerebral edema, which is basically swelling because of all the fluid collecting in your brain. And oftentimes they try to help people survive by drilling holes in their skull to relieve that pressure, or they try to drain it. But other times it's not caught, and we have negative consequences of death or more serious brain injuries. Other things that can happen in our brain is when we don't get enough blood flow. So oftentimes you hear people talk about a stroke. That is the common name for something known as cerebral vascular accident, or CVA. This just results when there is not enough blood circulation because it is either blocked, and because of this, our brain's not getting enough blood, which carries oxygen. If we're not getting oxygen, our cells start to die, and that can lead to effects against our brain. Now, some effects that could happen whenever you have a stroke is you can get something called hemiplegia, which is you can get paralysis because our brain does control our motor function of our arms and legs. You can also get aphasia. This is damage to our speech center, which, remember, this is mostly our Broca's area and located in our left hemisphere. There's also things called transient ischemic attacks, or TIAs, where we have restriction of blood flow. This can lead to numbness, paralysis, and impaired speech as well. The last thing that we're going to talk about is the terrible threes, because these are the three worst nervous system disorders that people categorize. First one is being Alzheimer's disease, and this is a progressive degenerative disease, which means the brain is continuously weakening, breaking down, and it gets worse as it goes along, hence the word progressive. Usually you start with a little bit of memory loss, then your mental deterioration increases where you don't even remember loved ones. You start to lose the ability to speak. You can't pay attention, and you will not be able to recognize people at all eventually in the end. The second and third one, Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease, this is going to be degeneration of our mental ability, but they affect the basal nuclei. Remember, basal nuclei, these are going to be in control of modifying movement. They work with your primary motor control center, and they have actually opposite effects. Parkinson's disease, they have trouble initiating movement or getting muscles going, and so they can result in some tremors. But Huntington's disease, they don't have trouble getting their muscles to move. They actually have trouble getting their muscles to stop. And so they often have wild, jerky movements, and these all are forms of our mental deterioration. And that's the end of the lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be more than happy to help.